of our beautiful native plants in Grey Bruce. So let's get started. I'm going to give you my reasons. And the first couple are they're just a bit heavy. So I'm warning you. After that, it lightens up a bit. So the first one is biodiversity. Here's a definition. It's the variety of life on Earth in all its forms and all its interactions. If that sounds bewilderingly broad, that's because it is. Biodiversity is the most complex feature of our planet, and it is the most vital. According to Professor David McDonald at Oxford University, an ecologist there, he said, without biodiversity, there's no future for humanity. That sounds kind of serious. Anyway, when we're thinking about what's that got to do with our planting native plants, let's keep in mind that biodiversity doesn't refer just to plants, it includes all living things. From large mammals to insects to birds and to billions of microorganisms that live in our soils. All of these things are connected. Plants create food out of sunlight and carbon. Insects and other animals eat them. Seeds are spread, forests, meadows, and wetlands grow. Our air is kept clean and healthy. Our water is filtered. Our soils remain productive. Or not. So we are losing biodiversity at an alarming rate, mostly due to urbanization, deforestation, and climate change. We are losing species, and this has an effect on the whole ecosystem. So as we think about this, and it's hard to think about this, naturally we might wonder, what has this got to do with our backyards? What has this got to do with our private spaces? Isn't this referring to the wilderness, to, quote, nature? Well, when we include native plants in our private spaces, that is, plants that have been here in our regions for thousands of years, probably longer, we're helping to retain and nurture our regional biodiversity. I believe that it is crucial that we shift our thinking a bit and recognize that our own gardens are part of the natural world, and we can all make small changes that can make a difference. I told you we were starting out with some heavy stuff. So here's this beautiful meadow that I saw at the Grey Sauble Arboretum just last week, full of beautiful native plants. A couple of them I'm going to mention as we go along. So you can just imagine the thousands of plants, probably hundreds of species, and all the microorganisms and the insects and birds and probably other little mammals living in this beautiful large meadow. That's a very good example of what we're talking about in terms of interactions and connections and biodiversity. So the next reason to think about native plants is climate change. And this is certainly another heavy duty thing. We know that we're having changing weather patterns observable quite easily in our area. As far as mitigating climate change, two of the most important things we can do as gardeners is to plant more trees, as many as we can, and mow less lawn. Those are the big ones. But planting native plants is important too. So how do our native plants adapt to climate change? They can adapt, but it's complicated. Plants can adapt to change, but they usually have lots of time, like hundreds or thousands and thousands of years to adapt to a temperature change or an adjusted climate. Some will do fine, some will not make it. But when we plant more native plants, we give the species more of a chance because we increase the genetic diversity within the species. And this may increase the chances that the plant can adapt and survive. Of course, this affects other species too. Here's an example of a beautiful native plant we have growing around here, bloodroot. And it provides one of the earliest meals for insects coming out of the ground or pupating in the early spring. So what happens when this plant comes up earlier, because spring is starting earlier, but the insect doesn't? It comes out later for various reasons. It's going to be looking for food and it won't be there. So there's these interactions that are very complex that we don't have the answers to. There are lots of questions and not a lot of answers. So what we want to be doing is trying to maintain this broad genetic diversity within native plants and planting them in different places and microclimates, and hopefully that will help them adapt over time. The next reason to plant native plants is to support our native pollinators. Insects, as you know, insects pollinate most of our food plants. insects pollinate most of our non-edible plants too. We're all familiar with honeybees that pollinate, bee people move around from place to place to pollinate orchards and fields, and they do a chunk of the work. But the significant amount of natural pollination through our native insects, primarily our native bees. And our insects pollinate most of our non-edible plants. There are some that will be pollinated through wind or through water, but other than that, it's our insects that are doing the job. Occasional other thing like a hummingbird, but it's mostly insects. We know our native bees and other insects populations are declining. Partly that's because many insects have unique relationships with native plants. It's what they eat, where they lay their eggs, etc. And as we lose those native plants, these native species lose their habitat. So here's a good example of a wonderful pollinator on a woodland sunflower, which is a really nice sunflower because it grows in a bit of shade and will be a bit of color in a shaded area later in the season. We think about pollinators, we want to support them for as long as we can, from the very early in the spring for those early bloomers like bloodroot to late season flowers of flowering plants. So here's a couple of interesting native plants. We're all familiar with goldenrod. It's everywhere, blooming beautifully right now, and it's really a gorgeous plant. It can be too aggressive and perhaps too large for home gardens. Interestingly, there's a number, like a dozen different goldenrod species, that some of whom are much more adaptable to home gardens, and some even do okay in shade. This is an example called stiff goldenrod. As you can see, the flower head shape is different than the dominant goldenrod we see in the countryside. And it's not as tall, it's about 3 to 4 feet, and it doesn't spread aggressively. The other flower is a pale purple coneflower, which is a coneflower native to Ontario that, as you can see, has a different sort of flower shape, which is, I think, quite elegant. Both of these are easy to grow from seed. So when we think about attracting bugs, pollinators are obvious, but we can also attract beneficial insects. Here's an example of one I found on my one of my black-eyed Susans just the other day, and I was able to identify this insect, which is often a challenge. This is a soldier beetle, and this soldier beetle isn't a great pollinator. It comes to these flowers because it eats the pollen and the nectar for its own resources, but it doesn't do much about pollinating. But it actually eats larvae of other beetles that can harm our plants, and it eats aphids or aphid larvae. So a number of these types of insects are attracted to native plants, and then they'll help you out on your other plants. So this guy will be around, ready to get those aphids that are attacking your beautiful roses. And of course, all of these insects become food sources for other insects and other animals. Most notably, our birds. If you have a chance to read this book, Bringing Nature Home by Dr. Doug Tallamy, he's an entomologist and insect PhD teacher at a university in Delaware, I think. He's produced a number of books and become very influential in this area, and it's a very interesting book. His latest is just about oak trees and what they contribute to the environment. Anyway, reading this book was really one of the things that made me think long and hard about eating native plants. No, this is not news. Birds feed their young insects, and they especially like to feed them caterpillars because of their density and nutrition in the caterpillar. And it takes between 3,000 and 6,000 caterpillars to feed a clutch of chickadees from the time they're hatched to the time they leave the nest. That was a staggering number to me, but in Tallamy's book, he talks a lot about those types of studies that he has done. So where do these poor parent birds find all these things to feed their hungry babies? Many caterpillars need specific native plants to feed on. The caterpillars and native plants have evolved over millions of years, and without the native plant, the caterpillar will not be feeding, the adults will not be created. So we need to think about providing what we call larval host plants for caterpillars. And so there's some really neat examples of larval host plants. I'm sure the main one we all know about is milkweed. It's the larval host plant for the monarch butterfly. It's the only thing the monarch caterpillars eat. And now that more people are aware of this, and you see a lot more milkweed than you used to, the numbers of monarch butterflies are improving, which is great to know. Here's another example that I learned about with the native plant Pearly Everlasting. I see this on beside the roads on the Bruce Peninsula. And when I planted some in my garden, which had a little better soil than alongside the roads, it just became this beautiful, lush plant covered with these beautiful white blossoms. And again, easy to grow from seed. It's the larval host of the American lady butterfly. And I've yet to see one, but I'm keeping my eye out, and especially for its very interesting caterpillar, which is almost as pretty as the butterfly itself. So there's a number of examples of larval hosts that we can think about having and including in our native plant list. Other things birds like to eat are related to native plants. Here's a lovely cedar waxwing eating the junipers off the juniper berries off a native juniper shrub. Above that is serviceberry, a really useful shrub in the garden, which some of the species can get 8 to 10 feet tall, covered in those white blooms in the spring and red berries late in summer and fall, and the birds love them. An interesting shrub that I've just started to use is buttonbush, the top left of your screen. It grows in wet areas, but it's doing fine in my garden where it's quite dry. And the blooms are quite unusual, as you can see, and birds really like the seeds. And then, of course, grasses, and leaving the seeds on our grasses is so important. This is a beautiful ornamental grass, bottlebrush rye. And the nice thing about this grass is it actually grows a bit of shade, which is unusual for grasses. And of course, our old friend coneflower, and a lot of small birds especially like the coneflower seeds. So it's really important to let them go to seed and sit in your garden over the fall months. So I've forgotten which number we're at, but this is my next reason. This is my next why, is think about trees and shrubs. We always focus on flowering plants and perennials, but we need to think about native trees and shrubs as well. Of course, trees provide shade and temperature moderation. All trees do that, not just native ones. And they all store a ton of carbon, which is why one of the most important things we can do is plant as many trees as we can. They also provide a habitat for food and food for insects and birds and small mammals. So this is a quote from Doug Ptolemy's book about oaks. So this is about the oak tree. Oaks are the quintessential wildlife plants. No other plant genus supports more species of butterflies and moths, thus providing more types of bird food than the mighty oak. We have other, there's no reason not to think about the ornamental aspect of shrubs and trees as well. So here's some examples of very lovely ornamental native shrubs. We all are probably familiar with pagoda dogwood, which is also Cornus alternifolia. I just planted one this year, and I got it at a local nursery, just one of the ordinary nurseries. They didn't advertise they were selling native plants or anything. It's done really well, and over time it will, I'm sure, start to look more like that. And the birds love the berries on the pagoda dogwood late in the season. On the upper right is flowering raspberry, which is from the rose family. And it has those lovely big, those are large, the blooms are maybe 2 or 3 inches wide. and it does okay in shade, which is interesting for a member of the rose family. And then witch hazel on the bottom right is a large shrub which will produce these very interesting flowers. And another thing about that is it's late in the season, which again provides some food for our late season pollinators. And think about ornamental, the ornamental side of our trees as well. Our beautiful birches and maples, all of these things have ornamental value as well. So when we're thinking about plant health, we can certainly say that gardening with native plants, you require less work. They don't need fertilizing. They rarely get diseases, but I'll tell you about this one. There's no need for pesticides, organic or not. And they do help reduce the spread of invasive species. They can't stop it by, again, taking up their rightful place. So having the whole horticultural principle of right plant and right place is well illustrated by the idea of planting native plants in our gardens. So this plant is wild bergamot, Monarda fistulosa, again, grown from seed. And it's a lovely color and easy to grow, and quite has to be about 3 to 4 feet tall. And it is known for having powdery mildew. So I planted it in a couple of different places. As you can see, this one's right against a wall, and you can see the spots in the leaves in this one. It has quite a bit of powdery mildew. I planted it elsewhere in a spot where there was airflow right through the garden, and it has a lot less. But I just wanted to show, to be honest with you, native plants can get some plant diseases, and though not nearly as often as our non-native or exotic species. So we're thinking about diseases and pests and whatnot. This is some leaf damage on one of a non-native rose. And so you start to think about leaf damage differently. I was quite delighted to see this because the particular shape of the holes in the leaves means that this is probably done by a leaf cutter bee. And Jennifer's going to talk a little bit more about that in her part of the presentation. And, you know, we don't even notice it until at least 10% of leaves on a tree are damaged. And most of the time, plants survive the type of leaf damage done by insects perfectly well. Oh, so there's my next reason. So now we're getting into some more interesting stuff. Native plants are beautiful. There's lots of beautiful native plants to choose from. And the more I learn about them, the more impressed I am. Yellow coneflower is a gorgeous plant, blooming now. It's tall, it's very elegant, slim. As you can see, it's also called gray-headed coneflower because before, just as it's coming out, the heads are grayish. I believe it's also known as prairie coneflower, but it grows very tall, and the plants are mature, the flowers are maturing at different times. So you get this very interesting collection of the flower in different stages. And the plant on the right is my plant of the year. I love this plant. It's called hairy beard tongue, which is a terrible name for a plant. But anyway, it's gorgeous. And it's about 1.5 feet high, 18 inches maybe. A beautiful, tons of bloom on it, of those beautiful purpley bell-shaped flowers with the white lips. And the bumblebees loved this plant. And it bloomed for about at least a month in the spring. So again, one I would highly recommend. More beauty. We all are familiar with lady slippers in Grey Bruce. We're kind of famous for them. This is the showy lady slippers. I just want to point out that I got this one at a nursery, and we should all be buying these things at nurseries, not harvesting from the wild. We may occasionally see this growing in the wild. And a blue vervain, which is again another beautiful native plant we see growing in the fields around here. It can be 4 to 5 feet tall, but such an interesting flower. What about the beauty of our non-flowering plants like ferns? Um, Ferns are in a different category. As you know, they're one of our oldest types of plants. They don't flower, they produce spores. And no insects eat them. They are immune to insect damage and pest diseases because they've been around for millions of years and they've evolved to produce chemicals that insects don't like. So ferns don't support insect life directly, but they provide habitat and they create some beautiful pictures in your garden, that's for sure. This is my favorite maidenhair fern. And then we have our conifers of all kinds and various sizes, which are also lovely. This is a hedge made of eastern white cedar. It's a pretty new, but you can make a very close cut, dense looking hedge, like a traditional hedge from eastern white cedar. This one looks like it's being trained to be a little looser, and that can be a little better for the birds. They can use it for nesting or protection because they can get into it more easily. But either way, it can create a lovely hedge. And of course, native grasses. There's some lovely ones that are easy to grow in our home gardens. Prairie dropseed is this gorgeous green, always fresh looking. And it's clump forming grass, so it doesn't spread. As is little blue stem on your right. Blue stem, that's a bit of a taller grass, maybe 3 feet-ish. And it turns a beautiful reddish color in the fall. So there's another thing to think about. More beauty, and these are things that, of course, are not the flowers or the plants themselves. This lovely fellow is I saw on my Coreopsis lanceolata tick seed, and its name is a Milbert tortoiseshell butterfly, which I thought was a wonderful name. And so lovely to see him and have him wait long enough for me to get a photo. And on the other side is that pink creature is the evening primrose moth, actually just called the primrose moth, a much simpler name than our other fellow, just sitting in an evening primrose flower, just minding his own business. I had never seen or heard of such a creature before, seeing it in the garden. And I guess that leads me to one of my last points, which is I had these 2 types of plants planted close together, the Coreopsis and the white yarrow, which is our native yarrow. And I went out one morning just to check things because, you know, as most gardeners, I like to walk around once or twice a day just to see what's going on. And when you have native plants, there's a lot going on. They're looking at these plants. There were probably hundreds of various types of insects, all of them not interested in me, not dangerous in any way. They don't sting, they don't cause any harm, just buzzing around these plants. As you can see, on these Coreopsis is a little butterfly, and I believe that's a type of bee, though I could be wrong. Bees and flies can get quite confusing. There's at least 2 or 3 different types of creatures on the white yarrow. So it was just alive. And I think what it made me recognize was a connection to the natural world. You know, all these insects have been around all the time, but they are much more likely to visit your yard and your space when you have native plants. And just to get to watch these creatures and learn about them is a wonderful opportunity. You get to just, if you're looking, you get to look, and then you get to just watch them, see what they're doing. This lovely bumblebee making his way through the scarlet bee balm. And this fellow on the right, actually it's female, was quite a surprise to me. And that is a pelicinid wasp. So it's a type of wasp, and not a stinging insect in any way. And it was just sort of sitting there. What an interesting creature, though. So I've come to the last reason, I've got to 10 by now, I've sort of lost track, is that having native plants in your garden is a lot easier than you think. You probably already have some already. I was really surprised to learn that spiderwort, which I've had in my garden for 20 years, is a native plant. And if you check it out when it's blooming, there's often little tiny moths on it. And it's a very, very pretty plant, an unusual leaf shape. We all know Rudbeckia, black-eyed Susans, brown-eyed Susans, and it's wonderful to see so many of them blooming at this time of year. They're a native plant. And the last one is Virginia creeper, this which turns red in the fall, as you know. And the seeds, the berries on Virginia creeper are excellent food for birds, and birds nest and take cover in Virginia creeper. So it's quite a useful native plant. So those are my reasons, my whys to consider planting native plants in your home garden. And I think what we'll do is go on to the next part of the presentation, which is the hows. And unless we want to have a few questions right now, it's up. What do you think, Kim? Are there questions in the chat? And should we stop for a minute or just go on to Jennifer's?
No questions in the chat. So I think going on is probably a great idea because we are already at 35 minutes. So
are we really?
Let's just go to the how. Sounds good.
Okay. Sorry, I just have to figure out how to move this.
Hi, everyone.
Okay.
My name is Jennifer, and I'm a master gardener in training. I'm sorry that I wasn't able to join you in real time today, but thank you so much for welcoming the Grey County Master Gardeners and for your interest in the value of native plants in everyday gardens. Vicky has talked to you today about why you'd want to choose native plants, and I'm going to talk to you a bit about how to work with them, whether you have an established garden or are just getting started. I am relatively new to working with native plants. The idea was introduced to me by the master gardeners. At first, I had a really hard time wrapping my head around the idea because when I heard the term native plant, I thought of ditches, roadsides, overgrown fields, messy places with scraggly plants and no order or structure. I also came to learn that wildflower and native plant are not the same thing. Native plants are considered to be those that have evolved here as part of the ecosystem over thousands of years. Many of the familiar plants that grow wild, plants like chicory, dandelion, Queen Anne's lace, have naturalized here, but were brought to Canada by European settlers and are non-native species. So how much of your garden needs to be native to make a difference? Science tells us that there is actually a magic number for that, and it's 70%. That is a lofty goal, and my own garden at home hovers somewhere around the 30% mark. But even 10% native is still better than 0% native. And if every home up and down the street planted 10%, that's still way better than a wasteland of mowed grass. So don't be discouraged and consider it something to strive for, knowing that every native species you plant will be a contribution. You might be listening today and thinking, what are you supposed to do with your garden full of non-native things? Just tear it out and start all over again? I mean, only if you want to. But if you already have a full garden, you also know that there's always room for just one more plant. If you're just getting started, having a blank slate is the perfect opportunity to plan a native garden from the ground up. More realistically, you probably already have at least a few things planted, and you can either add to what you already have or simply look for opportunities over time to replace individual plants with a native species that fills the same space. If you want native species for your garden, where do you get them from? It might be tempting to think that just because they grow wild, you can dig some stuff up and bring it home for your garden. There's a significant problem right now with large numbers of people taking up foraging as a hobby. Particularly closer to Toronto, there are places where areas of plants like wild leeks have been wiped out completely because everyone thinks they're just taking a few. As such, this practice is not considered ethical or sustainable. Instead, nurseries are catching on that people are looking for these plants, and they are getting much easier to find. This is a short list of nurseries just in our area who either specialize in or stock exclusively native species. If you don't travel, there's also the site Ontario Native Plants with an exhaustive list of stock and information on caring for them. But the shipping gets pretty steep, so you may want to go in with a friend and combine your orders. Large box stores are also starting to carry native species, but we always encourage you to support your local nurseries and growers first. It is important to note that the terms invasive and aggressive, which are often used interchangeably, are not the same thing. An invasive plant is an introduced species which makes its way into an ecosystem and successfully outcompetes the native plants, usually because there are no natural control mechanisms. Some examples of invasive species are garlic mustard, vinca, and the dog strangling vine. Aggressive is a plant that grows quickly, abundantly, spreads easily, and can be hard to get rid of, but it doesn't mean that it's not supposed to grow here. Some examples of aggressive natives are Virginia creeper, sunchokes, and trumpet vine. It's not that you can't grow these plants, but it's important to recognize how they behave before you spend the next 10 years of your life trying to get rid of them. One concept that it's important to recognize is that although a native plant garden can be beautiful, we need to change some of our notions about what a garden should be. Plants are chosen based on how they fit into the bigger picture, and how we care for those plants will change because different parts of the life cycle will be critical to other species. So we need to start to consider plants in terms of function and how they fit into the ecosystem, rather than just a traditional garden aesthetic. One of the big changes that I had to make was to no longer do a really thorough fall cleanup. I had become used to seeing bare soil in the spring and thought that I was doing a good job of keeping my yard neat and tidy. But if you look at a natural meadow or forest, the plants remain standing through the winter. Pollinators use the stems to build their nests. The leaves drop to the ground and create leaf litter that shelters different types of moths and butterflies. We often think of caterpillars as building their cocoons somewhere high in a tree, but the truth is that many of them drop to the ground and finish their development in the leaf litter. When we rake that up and get rid of it, we're also disposing of all of next year's pollinators. Keeping all of the organic material in the garden has other benefits as well. If you rake up and dispose of every piece of plant matter you can find, you're also throwing away valuable nutrients, which will need to be replenished with a continued application of compost or other fertilizers. The other benefit I'm learning about is that it's just less work. And in my old age, I am finding that I really am a lazy gardener and that life is too short to make extra work for myself. So I just leave those leaves alone. Another challenge to our old way of thinking is that our plants are not going to look perfect at all times. Our goal is to support other species, and sometimes that means that they're going to eat bits and pieces of our plants as part of their normal activities. Because most of the native insects have evolved alongside these plants, the damage is frequently only cosmetic. Shown here is the work of a busy little leafcutter bee who painstakingly cuts little round sections from the edge of your leaves. They create little packages to hold their eggs and larvae, which they then place inside the plant stems that you didn't tear down last fall. While many native plants lend themselves really well to an informal meadow-style garden, you may not want that. It was one of the reasons that I was so slow to get started on using these plants myself, because I couldn't picture them in any other gardening style. The first piece of useful advice I was given was to plant natives in groups. If you plant them together, it gives them a sense of being planted on purpose. When designing a native plant garden, you want to use all of the same elements you would when planting any other garden. Things like balance, texture, scale, and repetitive patterns will help you achieve any style of garden. One thing I noticed as I was putting together this presentation is that it seems like a lot of people were struggling with how to step outside that meadow garden format. If you Google native species gardens, it's pretty much an endless scroll of meadows. So I asked people in the Ontario Native Gardening Facebook group to share with me their photos of native plants used in other garden styles. And they got back to me with all sorts of really great inspiration. The one on the left is utilizing some groupings with different heights, textures, and colors. The one in the middle is a more formal garden style of natives edged in with a traditional low boxwood hedge. And I am especially fond of this grouping on the right, with two different types of bergamot set against the Culver's root. I think the contrast of the height and color and texture is just really delicious in this setup. And here are two more gardens with a more traditional garden design. The one on the left is a perennial border style with wild strawberry ground cover set against the height and color of aster, goldenrod, ironweed. And the gardener on the right has used newspaper and mulch for weed suppression. And you can see just off to the right, she has some logs in there, which provide habitat and break down over time. So there's a lot of naturalness to this garden, but the cement bird bath and the large rock focal points give it a more structured appearance. So you see, these plants are really versatile and can be incorporated into a number of garden styles. We just have to think outside the box a little bit. When choosing your plants, you have to remember that Ontario has a lot of different terrain and soil conditions. Just because it grows in Ontario doesn't mean that it grows anywhere. This prickly pear cactus on the left, who likes sandy, dry, full sun sites, will be very different from the cardinal flower on the right that prefers richer, wetter soils. We are going to touch briefly here on some plant selections for different sites and growing conditions. But if you're looking for plant ideas, general care, and planting suggestions, this has been one of my absolute favorite resources. This is totally a plug for this book, but I borrowed it from Vicky and I loved it so much that I had to buy my own copy. It's called 100 Easy to Grow Native Plants for Canadian Gardens by Lorraine Johnson. Let's talk about plants for specific locations. For sunny, dry locations, the prickly pear cactus, which is winter hardy to zone 5 if you have a fairly protected location, is a natural choice. But a lot of the showier native plants love a good sunny location. The dense blazing star with its purple inflorescences, brown-eyed Susans that bloom well into the fall, and the eye-catching scarlet bee balm are all easy to find at most garden centers. If you're fortunate enough to have some shade in your yard, it opens up the possibility for a lot of really unique woodland species who need the dappled light or full shade of a protective tree canopy. Many of our beautiful spring ephemerals, the plants that bloom and are gone before the trees leaf out, are woodland species. Things like trillium, mayapple, and jack in the pulpit with its unusual spadix. The spice bush is also a really good substitution for the common forsythia, and it has those bright yellow flowers early in the spring. But more importantly, it's a host plant for the beautiful spice bush swallowtail butterfly. There's also a common myth in Ontario that it's illegal to pick trilliums. This is not technically true, although picking the flowers will seriously injure and sometimes kill the plant, and it can take years to recover. So even though it's not illegal, you still shouldn't do it. With the effects of climate change, one of the things that we're seeing more frequently is extended periods without rain. Many municipalities have watering restrictions, and if you're on a well, it's important that you don't run dry because you had to water your plants. Native species are usually good choices in this regard because they've evolved to grow and reproduce without supplemental watering. Some hardy choices that don't need watering are the cheerful lance-leaf coreopsis, which is a type of tick seed, the small New Jersey tea shrub, and the Canada anemone, also known as a windflower. What if you have the opposite problem from drought? You may have a low-lying area that collects water and stays wet, or you want to build a rain garden that intentionally collects moisture and is a great way to help reduce runoff into the sewer system. The show-stopping red cardinal flower, sunny marsh marigolds, or blue lobelia are all plants that like to have their feet wet. Red osier dogwood is another good choice for marshy areas, and it also provides winter interest because the red twigs keep their color year-round. And finally, I will close with this picture of common milkweed. This is the definitive host plant for the monarch butterfly, whose numbers have been decimated. Until 2014, milkweed was actually listed on the schedule of noxious plants in Ontario. You couldn't plant it, and you could be forced to remove it if you did. This is important because it speaks volumes about how far removed from the natural world some of our gardening practices are and how damaging they can be. This is why native plant gardening is so important and so restorative to the environment. And I'm so pleased that there is such an interest in approaching gardening from an environmental and ecological focus rather than just as something pretty.
Okay. So thank you, Jennifer. I wish you could have been here. So that's it for our formal presentations. If anybody would like to ask questions or comments, we'd be glad to hear them.
We don't have any in the chat queue, Vicky. I did want to mention that the Lorraine Johnson book is in the West Gray Library collection, just so as you know, at the Durham branch. Now, Durham is closed right now because we're replacing the floors, but it'll reopen in early September. And people can still put a hold on it, and it will be available when the building opens again.
I think the Doug Ptolemy book is also in the library, Kim, because it's been out for a while, and I know.
You know what? I didn't check that one. Sorry, but I can.
Yeah, and there's lots of Lorraine Johnson did a seminar for us in the winter, and she has a number of books. Her definitive book was Natural Plants for the Ontario Natural Garden, written 20 years ago. I mean, she's really has been talking about this for a long time. And
yeah, I know I featured one of her books in our newsletter. So yeah, I'm delighted to hear she's such a well-respected authority.
She provided us with a list of plants that would be specific to Grey Bruce, and we can hand that along with our handout. And she's anything she has done or written, I would recommend for sure. But there's lots more resources that for native plants. The North American Native Plant Society, the NANPS, I believe it's called. Lorraine was the head of that a few years ago, but the website is great, and you can join it and then participate in either buying seeds or exchanging seeds or whatever. And there's tons of information there. So and anything about, if you look up pollinators, you'll get a ton of information about online pollinators. I think there's a website, just as again in our handout, you'll find more information about them as well. Lorraine partnered with us, a scientist who studied, an ecologist, to create a book called Flower Gardens for the Rusty Patched Bumblebee, which is unfortunately a species at risk. And it's free. If you go to the Friends of the Earth website, you can download it, and it's a really lovely little book that gives you actual, Jennifer's talking about garden plans and how to put these together. There's some actual plans of gardens for different situations and different climates, microclimates, etc., for native plants in this book. And I think it's really useful because it helps people get past that idea of how do we do this, So that's again if you go to the Friends of the Earth website, it's there. I think it's called Flower Garden for the Rusty Patch Bumblebee, something like that. And you can download it as a PDF for free.
Fantastic. Thank you, Vicky. That's so much good information. I did want to mention too that West Gray Library is opening its own seed library. And we're looking for donations for the next little while. So if you have some, we're looking for non-GMO and organic. Obviously, native would be a terrific boon. So if anyone has any that they're willing to contribute to the library, we will have them in. You can just contribute them through the Dropbox or in person once Durham branch is open again. And if you can include any information you have on it, including the name, any planting suggestions or recommendations, preferred spots, anything you can give to help another gardener make the most of it. Native seeds would be particularly welcome, I think, because they're still reasonably hard to get hold of. I know you guys talked about nurseries that have them. And I hope that's part of the handout because that's terrifically helpful. So if there are no, does anyone have a question? If you do, can you just unmute and speak up?
I think everybody wants to get back outside, Kim, on this beautiful day.
Yeah, quiet, tasteful little group. That's all good. So I'll just say thank you again, Vicky. That's been a really, really remarkable presentation. I'm sure everyone is really glad. Now you have a handout that you're going to forward to me and I will send it out to the participants today.
I'll do that.
So if you guys can keep an eye out for that and also for our feedback, let us know what worked, what didn't. It's a very short form, takes it less than a minute, and it really helps us. So I'll just say thank you to everyone for showing up, and a particular thank you to Vicky and in absentia to Jennifer for the amazing information and these eye-opening tidbits. I must say, I'll be looking at the colors in my garden a little differently and not with quite so much shame. They're probably native species. I've probably been doing great all along.
Sure.
Okay, thank you all very much. Look for the handout and the feedback, and by next week you'll be able to watch this again and again at your pleasure. And thanks again, Vicky. That was really helpful.
You're welcome. Anytime. Bye-bye.
Thank you so
I'm
much.
turning
Thank
the
you.
call off.
You're welcome.
Great. Thank you.